Power without compassion breeds emptiness. You can hold the world in your hands, command every soul beneath your feet, and yet find yourself utterly alone. The story of that master in Alabama is not only a relic of history, it is a reflection of something deeper within the human heart. He had wealth, authority, and control, yet he lived surrounded by silence, by shadows, by an emptiness that no possession could fill. When a man wields power without love, without mercy, he becomes both ruler and prisoner at once. His power isolates him. His dominance becomes a wall, not a throne. Think of it. A man who could buy lives with a handful of coins, but could not buy peace for his own spirit. He could command others to serve, yet could not command his own heart to feel. That is the curse of power without compassion. It feeds the ego but starves the soul. The master may have been surrounded by people, yet none truly saw him, because he himself never saw them as human. When you strip others of their dignity, you strip yourself of your own humanity in return. True power does not come from ownership. It comes from understanding. Compassion is not weakness, it is strength in its highest form. To look at another being and see pain, to recognize it, to feel it, that is where real power lies. The kind of power that heals instead of harms, that builds instead of breaks. But when compassion dies, power becomes a hollow shell. It can control bodies, but never hearts. It can build empires, but not peace. In Alabama, 1852, slavery was the law, and cruelty was routine. Yet even in such times, the line between master and slave was more fragile than men like him ever understood. He may have ruled over 7 lives, but in truth, he was the most captive of them all. Captive to his pride, his loneliness, his need to feel significant. Power had made him blind, and blindness made him empty. Without compassion, his strength became his cage. You see, compassion gives meaning to authority. It turns power into purpose. Without it, what is power but a desperate attempt to hide weakness? The master could control everything around him but not the ache inside him. Every command he gave was a cry for connection that never came. Every act of dominance was an attempt to prove something to himself, that he mattered, that he was alive, that he was not as empty as he felt. But power without compassion is a mirage. It offers the illusion of control while quietly eroding the spirit from within. Imagine holding power that everyone fears, yet no one loves you. People obey you, but not because they respect you. They obey because they fear your wrath. That's not leadership, it's loneliness disguised as dominance. Compassion, on the other hand, invites loyalty born from respect and love. It bridges the distance between hearts. Without it, power isolates. It creates silence, distance, distrust. And in that silence, even the strongest man begins to crumble. The master lived in a world that taught him power was everything. But power without heart becomes poison. It corrodes relationships, it destroys connection, it leaves only emptiness in its wake. When he brought those 7 women into his home, he thought he was purchasing service. He did not realize he was bringing in 7 mirrors, each one reflecting a piece of his own lost humanity. For in the eyes of those he owned, he saw what he had lost: compassion, connection, and the simple ability to care. Compassion is the heartbeat of every soul that has known suffering. Without it, a man may exist but he does not live. The master's story reminds us that dominance without empathy is not strength, it is decay. A man can stand tall before the world and yet feel smaller than the smallest soul he commands. Power may fill his house, but compassion is what fills his heart. When it is absent, even the most powerful man walks through life hollow, searching for meaning in the echoes of his own silence. Love can rise even from the ashes of oppression. It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? How could something so pure grow out of something so cruel? How could affection bloom where pain has lived, where freedom has been stolen, and where humanity has been denied? Yet history and the human heart have a strange way of defying reason. Love, in its truest form, is not a product of perfect conditions. It is a force that refuses to die, even in the darkest corners of existence. In that house in Alabama, where chains once clinked and silence spoke louder than words, something began to change. The master had all the power, but no peace. The women had no freedom, yet within them lived the unbroken pulse of survival. It is from such contradiction that love sometimes emerges, not as romance, not as comfort, but as resistance, as the soul's final rebellion against despair. When everything has been taken, love becomes the last thing that cannot be owned. At first, the master saw them as property. 7 women, 7 bodies, 7 reminders of his authority. But time does something to even the hardest heart when it faces the steady gaze of another human being. One of those women, quiet yet unyielding, carried a kind of strength he did not understand. She spoke little, but her silence carried a dignity he could not command. There are moments when even the oppressor feels the weight of his own wrongs, not through punishment, but through the reflection of humanity in the eyes of the oppressed. That reflection can haunt, soften, and eventually transform. Love born in such a place does not look gentle. It is not filled with flowers or laughter. It is cautious, wounded, trembling between fear and hope. Yet it is real, because it is born not from convenience, but from survival. It grows like a fragile vine through cracks in concrete against all odds, yet determined to live. When the master's heart began to soften, he didn't know what to call it. Perhaps it began as guilt, or as fascination, or as longing for something beyond his reach. But slowly, it became something else, something that stripped him of his false power and exposed the truth he had long buried. For the woman, love was never surrender. It was courage. To love someone who once held your life in his hands is not weakness, it is a form of strength that defies cruelty itself. She did not love the master as he was, she loved what he could become, what he began to glimpse within himself through her presence. Her compassion was not consent, it was defiance in the most human form. In her quiet forgiveness, she disarmed his authority. In her ability to feel where most would choose hatred, she became freer than he had ever been. Love in the ashes of oppression transforms both giver and receiver. It does not erase the past, but it redeems the heart. The master began to see her not as a slave, not as property, but as a soul. That recognition was the beginning of his undoing, because once a man sees humanity where he had denied it, he cannot unsee it. Love forced him to confront his cruelty, to feel the unbearable weight of what he had done. It stripped away his pride, his illusion of control, his false sense of superiority. And for the first time, he began to understand what freedom truly meant, not for her alone, but for himself. The power of love is that it can rise where it has no reason to. It can grow in soil watered by tears and blood. It can take root in a world that denies its existence. And when it rises, it changes everything. Love in its purest form is not dependent on circumstance, it transcends it. Even in the twisted shadows of slavery, love found a way to breathe. Not to justify what was done, but to show that humanity, no matter how deeply buried, can still awaken. That house, once a symbol of power and pain, became a place where 2 broken souls began to rebuild what the world had tried to destroy. Love did not erase the scars, it illuminated them. It showed that even from the ashes of oppression, something sacred can rise not as perfection, but as proof that the human heart cannot be fully enslaved. Freedom begins where empathy awakens. A man can live his whole life believing he is free while being bound by chains he cannot see. Chains of pride, ignorance, fear, and indifference. The master in Alabama had wealth, land, power, and control, yet he was not free. He was trapped inside the prison of his own superiority. True freedom does not begin when chains are broken from the body, it begins when chains fall away from the mind and the heart. It begins the moment one soul truly feels the suffering of another and cannot turn away. Empathy is the first spark of liberation. It opens the eyes of the oppressor and the oppressed alike. For the one who holds power, empathy becomes the moment he realizes the humanity of those he once dehumanized. For the one who suffers, empathy becomes the bridge that turns pain into strength. When the master began to see the women not as property but as people, something within him shifted. It was not a grand revelation or a sudden change, it was a slow, painful awakening. The walls he built to protect his ego began to crack. He saw fear in their eyes, and for the first time, he felt it echo inside his own chest. Empathy is dangerous to cruelty because it destroys distance. It dissolves the illusion that we are separate from one another. Once you feel another's pain, it becomes impossible to justify their suffering. The master's awakening did not come from education or religion or law, it came from proximity to pain. From seeing a tear he could not ignore, from hearing a silence that screamed louder than any protest. That is where freedom begins, not in rebellion alone, but in recognition. The recognition that every soul, no matter how lowly the world deems it, is made of the same light and breath. When empathy enters the heart, it challenges everything built on pride. It questions authority, it exposes hypocrisy, and it demands change. The master had lived years believing he was in control, but empathy stripped him of that illusion. For the first time, he saw that power built on suffering is not power, it is fear disguised as dominance. He began to feel the weight of every command he gave, every injustice he enforced. The same man who once believed he owned others began to feel owned by his guilt, enslaved by his own heart's awakening. Yet that was the first real taste of freedom he had ever known. Freedom born from empathy does not come easily. It tears through denial, it breaks comfort, it forces confrontation with truth. But without it, no law, no revolution, no decree can truly free the human spirit. Empathy gives meaning to freedom. It transforms it from a privilege into a shared responsibility. Because when you begin to feel for another, you can no longer live only for yourself. You begin to act, to speak, to stand, not out of obligation but out of recognition that your liberation is tied to theirs. In that house in Alabama, empathy began as a seed, a small, fragile realization in the heart of a man who had long forgotten how to feel. Each moment he allowed himself to see them as human, his own soul began to breathe. The air of freedom entered not through the open door, but through the opening of his heart. The women, too, felt a shift. They were still bound, yet something invisible began to change. The master's eyes no longer looked with cold possession but with reluctant understanding. And that understanding, though faint, carried power. Empathy had begun to set both the enslaved and the enslaver free, not through law, but through truth. When empathy awakens, it dismantles the false hierarchies of the world. It teaches that no life is higher, no pain is lesser, no story unworthy of being heard. Freedom is not simply the absence of chains, it is the presence of connection. It is the courage to look beyond yourself and see the whole of humanity reflected in the eyes of another. The master's greatest act of liberation was not freeing others, it was allowing empathy to free him from the prison of his own heart. For only when a person learns to feel for another, truly feel, does he begin to walk the path toward freedom.